Sarah Chen had never imagined that her life would change forever on a Tuesday morning in September while she was restocking fertilizer bags at Chen's farm supply. The bell above the store door chimed as two uniformed Navy officers stepped inside, their faces bearing the solemn expression that every military family dreads seeing. Her older brother Marcus had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months. Sarah knew the statistics, she had memorized them during sleepless nights when worry consumed her thoughts. But statistics felt abstract until they became personal, until they transformed from numbers into the devastating reality that Marcus would never come home. The officers spoke in careful, practiced words about honor and sacrifice, but Sarah heard only fragments through the roaring in her ears. Roadside bomb. Immediate death. Hero's funeral. The words felt foreign, impossible, like they belonged to someone else's nightmare. Her parents collapsed into each other's arms, their grief filling the small store with raw, broken sounds. But Sarah stood motionless, feeling something cold and sharp crystallizing inside her chest. This wasn't just loss, it was rage. Pure, focused rage at a world that could steal someone like Marcus, someone who had joined the military to help rebuild schools and protect civilians. That night, while her parents made funeral arrangements and relatives filled their house with casseroles and condolences, Sarah locked herself in Marcus's old room. She sat on his bed, surrounded by his high school football trophies and pictures of him in his Navy uniform, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to join the military. Not just join, she was going to become the best warrior the Navy had ever produced. She was going to make sure that no other family would lose someone the way they had lost Marcus. And if that meant becoming something dangerous, something that made enemies afraid to close their eyes at night, then so be it. The next morning, Sarah drove to the Navy recruitment office in Lincoln, 3 hours from their small town of Millfield. The recruiter, a weathered chief petty officer named Rodriguez, looked skeptical when this slight, 19-year-old farm girl announced that she wanted to become a Navy SEAL. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said gently, "the SEALs don't accept women. It's one of the last male-only units in the military." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then, I'll be the first." Rodriguez studied her face, seeing something in her eyes that made him reconsider his automatic dismissal. "The training will break you. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Men twice your size quit in the first week." "I won't quit." "Why do you want this?" "Really?" Sarah didn't mention Marcus. She didn't talk about revenge or rage or the hollow ache in her chest. Instead, she said simply, "Because someone has to." Rodriguez spent the next 2 hours explaining exactly what she was signing up for. The physical demands that would push her body beyond its limits. The psychological pressure designed to weed out anyone who might crack under the extreme stress of special operations. The reality that even if she somehow survived the training, she would spend her life in the world's most dangerous places, facing enemies who would show no mercy if they captured her. When he finished, Sarah signed the papers without hesitation. The first challenge came before she even left Nebraska. Her parents, still raw from losing Marcus, were horrified by her decision. Her father, a gentleman who had never raised his voice to his children, shouted at her for the first time in her life. "You want to get yourself killed too?" he demanded, his face red with anguish. "Isn't losing one child enough?" Her mother wept, begging Sarah to reconsider, to choose college instead, to choose life instead of what seemed like a death wish. But Sarah had moved beyond their ability to reach her. The girl who had worried about algebra tests and prom dresses was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more determined. She spent her last months in Millfield preparing with an intensity that frightened her family and friends. She ran 10 miles every morning before dawn, then lifted weights in the high school gym until her muscles screamed. She studied military tactics and weapons systems with the same focus she had once applied to 4-H projects. She learned to shoot with her father's hunting rifles, discovering a natural talent that unnerved everyone who watched her put bullet after bullet through the center of distant targets. The transformation was visible to everyone who knew her. Sarah had always been pretty in a quiet, understated way, but now she carried herself differently. There was a predatory grace in the way she moved, a calculating intelligence in her dark eyes that made people step aside when she walked past. Her best friend Jessica tried to stage an intervention 3 weeks before Sarah was scheduled to leave for basic training. "This isn't you, Sarah," Jessica pleaded as they sat in the parking lot outside their old high school. "You're scaring people." "You're scaring me." "Good," Sarah replied without emotion. "Fear keeps people alive." Jessica stared at her friend, seeing a stranger wearing Sarah's face. Marcus wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you to throw your life away for revenge. For a moment, something flickered in Sarah's eyes, grief, perhaps, or regret. But, then, it was gone, replaced by the cold determination that had become her constant companion. Marcus is dead, Sarah said quietly. And, the people who killed him are still breathing. That's not acceptable. When the day finally came for Sarah to leave Millfield, her parents drove her to the train station in silence. Her mother cried quietly in the passenger seat while her father gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. They had said everything there was to say, argued every argument, made every plea. Nothing had changed Sarah's mind. At the station, her mother hugged her fiercely, whispering prayers and promises to write every day. Her father shook her hand formally, as if she were already a soldier rather than his daughter. In his eyes, Sarah saw the terrible recognition that the girl he had raised was already gone, replaced by something he didn't understand and couldn't save. The train pulled away from the station, carrying Sarah toward a future that would transform her into something beyond her family's worst nightmares and greatest hopes. She pressed her face to the window, watching Millfield disappear behind her, and felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of a journey begun. She had no way of knowing that within 2 years, she would be standing over the bodies of the men who had killed her brother, or that the skills she was about to learn would make her both America's most valuable asset and its most dangerous secret. All she knew was that she had chosen a path that led away from safety, away from the life everyone expected her to live, and toward something darker and more terrible than anyone could imagine. The train carried her east through the Nebraska countryside, past farms and small towns where families slept peacefully, protected by people they would never know, people like the woman Sarah was about to become. In the reflection of the window, she saw her own face staring back, still young, still recognizable as the farm girl from Millfield, but with eyes that already held shadows of the future. By the time she reached the naval training facility in Illinois, Sarah had made peace with what she was about to become. She would be a guardian, protecting the innocent. She would be an assassin, eliminating threats. Most importantly, she would be exactly what the world needed her to be, no matter what it cost her soul. The girl who had once worried about disappointing her parents was about to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed, and enemies would learn to fear the sound of her name whispered in the darkness. But all of that was still ahead of her as the train pulled into the station, and Sarah Chin took her first step toward becoming America's most fearsome female warrior. The water was so cold it felt like knives against Sarah's skin as she plunged into the Pacific Ocean for the 5th time that morning. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, and every rational part of her brain demanded that she quit this madness and go home to Nebraska. Instead, she surfaced with a gasp and began swimming toward the distant buoy that marked another milestone in her journey toward becoming something unprecedented in military history. Basic training had been difficult but manageable. Sarah's farm-bred strength and determination had carried her through the physical challenges, while her intelligence had made the academic requirements seem almost easy. She had graduated at the top of her class, earning the grudging respect of instructors who had initially doubted that a small-town girl belonged in the Navy. But SEAL training was something else entirely. It was designed to break people, to strip away every comfortable illusion and reveal the raw truth of what lay beneath. For 18 weeks, Sarah would be pushed beyond every limit she thought she had, tested in ways that would reshape her understanding of what was humanly possible. The instructors made no secret of their skepticism about having a woman in their program. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had earned his stripes in Iraq and Afghanistan, addressed the issue on Sarah's first day. "I don't care what the politicians in Washington decided," he announced to the assembled candidates. "This isn't about equality. This isn't about making anyone feel good about themselves. This is about creating warriors who can save American lives in the worst situations imaginable. If you can't handle that pressure, if you're here to prove a point instead of becoming a weapon, you'll wash out. No exceptions." His eyes found Sarah in the group of exhausted, shivering candidates. "And if you think we're going to go easy on anyone because of their chromosomes, you're in for a very unpleasant surprise." Sarah met his stare without flinching. "I wouldn't want it any other way, Chief." The first weeks were a blur of impossible physical demands. 20-mile runs in full gear. Obstacle courses that seemed designed by sadists. Swimming exercises that pushed her to the edge of drowning. Sarah watched as men twice her size collapsed, overcome by exhaustion and despair, but she kept moving forward through sheer force of will. The mental challenges were equally brutal. Sleep deprivation exercises that left her hallucinating.
stress tests that required split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance.
Scenarios designed to break down the psychological barriers that separated rational human beings from efficient killing machines.
During Hell Week, the notorious 5-day crucible that eliminated most candidates, Sarah discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed.
While other candidates collapsed into hypothermic stupors or simply gave up and rang the bell that would end their suffering, Sarah endured. When her body failed, her mind took over. When her mind went blank with exhaustion, something deeper kept her moving, a cold, implacable determination that impressed even the most skeptical instructors.
Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the program director, watched Sarah drag herself through an underwater demolition exercise on day 4 of Hell Week.
She had been in the water for 6 hours, her lips blue with cold, her hands so numb she could barely grip the equipment. But she completed the mission parameters with mathematical precision, surfacing exactly where and when she was supposed to, despite conditions that had already sent 3 male candidates to the medical facility.
"What drives you, Chen?" Hayes asked her during the brief respite between exercises.
Sarah, too exhausted for anything but honesty, answered without hesitation.
"Dead enemies don't kill Americans." Hayes nodded slowly.
He had seen thousands of candidates come through the program, but few with the kind of focused intensity that Sarah displayed. She wasn't just trying to prove herself or overcome a challenge, she was preparing for a war that existed primarily in her own mind, a personal conflict that gave her strength when her body should have failed.
The weapons training revealed Sarah's most frightening talent.
She had always been a good shot with her father's hunting rifles, but military firearms were a different universe entirely. The first time she picked up an M4 carbine, something clicked into place that made her instructors exchange worried glances. Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson, the senior weapons instructor, had been teaching men to kill efficiently for 15 years. He had seen natural shooters before, candidates who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of ballistics and target acquisition. But Sarah was something beyond natural talent. She was methodical, calculating, and utterly without mercy when she had a weapon in her hands. During a close-quarters combat exercise, Sarah eliminated 12 enemy targets in a mock village setting in under 90 seconds. Her movements were fluid, economical, and devastatingly effective. She cleared rooms with a precision that spoke of hours spent visualizing exactly these scenarios, and her accuracy with both firearms and edged weapons was consistently perfect.
"She's not learning this stuff," Jackson confided to Hayes after one particularly impressive demonstration.
"It's like she already knows it and we're just helping her remember." The psychological evaluations painted a complex picture. Sarah scored at the top of every cognitive test, demonstrated exceptional stress tolerance, and showed no signs of the mental health issues that might disqualify her from active duty. But there were concerns about her emotional state that worried the program's psychiatrists.
Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the Navy's senior psychologist, conducted several extended interviews with Sarah throughout the training process.
What she found was a young woman who had essentially amputated her emotional responses to trauma and grief, replacing them with a cold, functional determination that was both impressive and deeply troubling. "She's created a psychological barrier between herself and anything that might interfere with her mission focus," Dr. Warren noted in her confidential evaluation. "While this makes her incredibly effective in training scenarios, I'm concerned about her ability to form normal human connections or process traumatic experiences in healthy ways." When Dr. Warren asked Sarah about her long-term goals, the answer was chilling in its simplicity. "I want to find the people who killed my brother," Sarah said calmly. "I want to look them in the eye when they realize they're going to die.
And then, I want to make sure they never hurt anyone else." "And after that?" Sarah seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "After that doesn't matter." Despite these psychological concerns, Sarah's performance in every other area was so exceptional that the evaluation board had no choice but to recommend her continuation in the program. She was setting records in physical fitness, demolishing previous standards for marksmanship, and displaying tactical intelligence that impressed even veteran special operations officers. The breaking point came during the final weeks of training, when candidates were subjected to survival, evasion, resistance, and escape (SEER) exercises. These simulations were designed to replicate the experience of being captured by enemy forces, complete with interrogation techniques that pushed psychological endurance to its limits. Sarah was captured during a nighttime reconnaissance mission and subjected to 36 hours of intensive interrogation by instructors playing enemy agents.
The techniques used were harsh but legal stress positions, temperature extremes, psychological manipulation, and constant pressure designed to break down resistance and extract information. Most candidates broke within the first 12 hours, providing their captors with the classified information they were supposed to protect. This was expected and planned for. The exercise was about learning to resist as long as possible and recover from the psychological trauma of breaking under pressure.
Sarah never broke.
For 36 hours, she endured everything her instructors could legally subject her to. She was hung in stress positions until her shoulders dislocated. She was subjected to temperature extremes that left her shivering uncontrollably or sweating through dehydration. She was bombarded with psychological attacks designed to shatter her sense of identity and purpose. Through it all, she said nothing. She provided only her name, rank, and serial number, delivered in the same calm, controlled voice regardless of what was being done to her. When the exercise finally ended, Sarah had to be helped to her feet because her body had shut down from exhaustion, but her mind remained completely focused and functional. The instructors conducting the exercise were shaken by what they had witnessed. They had pushed this young woman to limits that broke experienced male operators, and she had absorbed everything without showing any signs of psychological damage or emotional distress. "It's not that she's stronger than pain," one instructor explained to Dr. Warren afterward. "It's that she's learned to exist in a place where pain doesn't matter." I don't know if that makes her the perfect soldier or something we should be afraid of. When Sarah graduated from SEAL training 6 months later, she had achieved something unprecedented in military history. She was the first woman to complete the program, but, more than that, she had posted performance scores that ranked among the best in the program's 50-year history. The graduation ceremony was attended by senior military officials and politicians eager to celebrate this historic achievement. Sarah stood at attention as medals were pinned to her chest and speeches were made about breaking barriers and expanding opportunities. But those who knew her best saw something that the cameras didn't capture. The young woman who had entered the program still carried traces of the farm girl from Nebraska, still showed flickers of the person she had been before tragedy reshaped her. The woman who graduated was something else entirely, a perfectly calibrated instrument of violence, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. During the reception after the ceremony, Lieutenant Commander Hayes pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he said. "You should be proud." Sarah's response was delivered without emotion. "Pride is irrelevant. When do I get my first mission assignment?" Hayes studied her face, seeing the transformation that training had wrought. The Sarah Chen who graduated from SEAL training was no longer the grief-stricken girl who had signed up for revenge. She was something new, a guardian who could become an assassin without hesitation, a protector whose methods would make her enemies wish they had never been born. Within weeks, Sarah would be deployed to Afghanistan, where she would finally come face to face with the forces that had killed her brother. But the woman who stepped off the plane in Kabul bore little resemblance to the farm girl who had once worried about disappointing her parents. She was now America's most dangerous secret weapon, and the world was about to discover exactly what that meant. The helicopter descended through the pre-dawn darkness toward a landing zone that existed only as coordinates on a classified map. Sarah checked her equipment for the 4th time in 10 minutes, not because she needed to, but because the ritual helped maintain the razor-sharp focus that kept special operators alive in hostile territory. Her M4 carbine was loaded and ready, her sidearm secured but accessible, and the array of specialized gear strapped to her body turned her into a walking arsenal capable of handling any threat the Afghan mountains could produce. This was her 7th mission in 3 months, but the first that might lead her to the specific group of insurgents responsible for her brother's death. Intelligence sources had identified a Taliban cell operating in the Kunar province that specialized in roadside bombings targeting American convoys. They were skilled, elusive, and directly responsible for at least a dozen American deaths over the past year. Sarah's commanding officer, Major David Torres, briefed the 4-person team during the flight to their insertion point. Torres was a veteran of multiple deployments who had initially been skeptical about having a woman on his team, but Sarah's performance in previous missions had eliminated any doubts about her capabilities. "Primary objective is intelligence gathering," Torres explained over the helicopter's engine noise. "We need to locate their bomb-making facility and identify key personnel. Secondary objective is disruption of operations if the opportunity presents itself. Rules of engagement are weapons-free if we encounter hostile forces." The other team members, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Williams, and Corporal Mitchell, had worked with Sarah long enough to trust her skills completely. She had proven herself in firefights and reconnaissance missions, demonstrating a lethal efficiency that made her an invaluable asset in the field. But none of them knew about Sarah's personal connection to this particular mission. As far as they were concerned, she was simply the most dangerous woman in the United States military, someone whose tactical skills and emotional control made her perfect for the darkest corners of the war on terror. The helicopter touched down in a valley surrounded by jagged peaks that looked like broken teeth against the star-filled sky. The team moved out immediately, disappearing into the rocky terrain with practiced stealth. They had 12 hours to complete their mission and reach the extraction point before daylight made their presence impossible to conceal. Sarah took point, her night vision equipment turning the harsh landscape into a green-tinted maze of shadows and potential threats. She moved through the terrain like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground, her breathing controlled and steady despite the altitude and physical demands of their movement. 3 hours into the mission, they reached the target area, a cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in a hidden valley that satellite surveillance had identified as a possible insurgent stronghold. Sarah used hand signals to position her team for observation, then settled into a concealed position to study the compound through high-powered optics. What she saw through her scope made her blood run cold with recognition. The man emerging from the largest building matched the description of Ahmed Nazir, the Taliban bombmaker whom intelligence agencies had linked to the attack that killed Marcus. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 50, with a gray beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades fighting in these mountains. For a moment, Sarah's professional composure cracked. She was looking at one of the men responsible for her brother's death, someone whose hands had built the device that had torn Marcus apart in a moment of fire and twisted metal. Every instinct screamed at her to take the shot, to end Nazir's life with a single squeeze of her trigger finger. But she was a professional, and the mission parameters were clear. Intelligence gathering first, direct action only if necessary for team survival. She forced herself to continue observation, cataloging the compound's defenses and identifying other potential targets. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah's team gathered crucial intelligence about the insurgent cell's operations. They photographed key personnel, mapped the compound's layout, and identified what appeared to be a workshop where explosive devices were assembled. The information they collected would save American lives by allowing future operations to disrupt the group's activities. As dawn approached, the team prepared to withdraw to their extraction point. The mission had been a complete success by any military standard. They had penetrated deep into enemy territory, gathered valuable intelligence, and maintained their concealment throughout the operation. But, as they began their movement away from the compound, everything went wrong. A local shepherd, moving his flock through the valley at first light, stumbled across their hidden observation post. The man was clearly a civilian, unarmed and terrified by the sudden appearance of American soldiers in combat gear. Protocol demanded that they detain him temporarily to prevent compromise of their mission, but doing so would require them to alter their extraction timeline significantly. Before anyone could react, the shepherd began shouting in Pashto, his voice echoing across the valley in the morning stillness. Within seconds, the compound erupted into activity as insurgents responded to his warning. "Contact!" Rodriguez shouted as muzzle flashes began erupting from the buildings below them. The team found themselves caught in an exposed position, taking fire from multiple directions as the insurgents attempted to surround them. What followed was the kind of close-quarters combat that separated elite operators from ordinary soldiers. Sarah moved through the firefight with deadly precision, her rifle finding targets with mechanical efficiency while her team fought to reach a defensible position. She watched Williams take a bullet in the shoulder, saw Mitchell dive behind inadequate cover as automatic weapons fire chewed up the rocks around him. These were her brothers in arms, men who trusted her completely, and they were in danger because of a mission she had pushed for based on personal vendetta rather than military necessity. The realization transformed something fundamental in Sarah's approach to the fight. She was no longer the cold, calculating operative who had been shaped by training and trauma. She was a protector, someone whose skills existed to keep good people alive in impossible situations. Moving with fluid grace through the chaos of battle, Sarah began systematically eliminating threats. Her rifle cracked repeatedly, each shot finding its target with lethal precision. She flanked enemy positions with movements so quick and precise that the insurgents couldn't track her location long enough to return effective fire. When her rifle ran empty, she transitioned to her sidearm without missing a beat. When that was depleted, she drew the combat knife strapped to her thigh and closed with an enemy fighter who had gotten too close to Rodriguez's position. The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds and ended with the insurgent dead and Sarah moving to the next threat. Major Torres, wounded but still functional, coordinated their fighting withdrawal toward the extraction point. Sarah provided overwatch, her remaining ammunition carefully rationed to provide maximum effect. She had become something beyond human in the firefight, a lethal force that moved through enemy positions like death itself. As they reached the pickup zone, Sarah found herself face to face with Ahmed Nazir himself. The bomb maker had taken position behind a rock outcropping, attempting to prevent their escape with a Russian-made rifle that he handled with obvious expertise. Time seemed to slow as Sarah raised her weapon. This was the man who had killed her brother, who had built the device that had torn apart Marcus's convoy and ended his life in a moment of terror and pain. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, imagined exactly what she would say and do when she finally confronted one of the people responsible for her family's suffering. But, when the moment came, Sarah felt nothing except the cold professionalism that training had drilled into her. Nazir was simply another target, another threat to be eliminated with maximum efficiency. Her rifle fired once, and the bomb maker dropped behind his cover, dead before he hit the ground. The extraction helicopter arrived as the firefight ended, its door gunners providing covering fire as the team boarded. Sarah was the last one aboard, maintaining rear security until the aircraft lifted off and carried them away from the valley where she had finally achieved the revenge she had sought for so long. During the flight back to base, Torres checked on his team's condition and compiled his after-action report. Williams would need medical attention for his shoulder wound, but everyone was alive and functional. The mission had been a tactical success despite the compromise. They had gathered valuable intelligence and eliminated a significant threat to American forces. But Sarah sat in silence during the return flight, staring out at the Afghan landscape passing below them. She had killed Ahmed Nazir, one of the men responsible for Marcus's death, but the victory felt hollow and incomplete. The rage that had driven her through SEAL training and sustained her through months of preparation was simply gone, replaced by an emptiness that she hadn't expected. When they landed at the forward operating base, Sarah's teammates slapped her on the back and praised her performance during the firefight. She had saved their lives with skills that bordered on superhuman, and they knew it. But their gratitude felt distant and unreal, as if it were directed at someone else entirely. Later that night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and tried to process what she was feeling. She had accomplished what she set out to do when she left Nebraska. She had become a weapon capable of hunting down her brother's killers and making them pay for what they had done. But the satisfaction she had expected was nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt only a profound sense of purpose that had nothing to do with revenge. During the firefight, when she had moved to protect her teammates, she had discovered something that training had never taught her. Her skills weren't just weapons for personal vengeance, they were tools for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Major Torres found her sitting on the steps outside the base chapel, cleaning her rifle with the methodical care that had become second nature. "How are you holding up, Chen?" he asked, settling beside her on the concrete steps. Sarah continued working on her weapon as she answered. "I thought killing Nazir would feel different." Torres nodded. He had seen other soldiers struggle with the aftermath of personal vengeance, the way that achieving long-sought revenge often left people feeling more empty than satisfied. "What's next for you?" he asked. Sarah looked up from her rifle, her dark eyes reflecting the stars visible in the clear Afghan sky. When she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that hadn't been there before. "There are more bad people out there," she said simply. "People who hurt innocents. People who need to be stopped." Torres studied her face, recognizing something in her expression that he had seen in other elite operators. Sarah had evolved beyond the personal mission that had brought her to Afghanistan. She was becoming something rarer and more dangerous, a professional who understood that her skills came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal satisfaction. Within weeks, Sarah would be reassigned to a classified unit that operated in the darkest corners of the global war on terror. She would become a ghost, someone whose existence was known only to a select few and whose actions would save lives in ways that could never be acknowledged publicly. But the woman who would emerge from the Afghan mountains was fundamentally different from the one who had entered them seeking revenge. Sarah Chen had discovered her true calling, and the world's most dangerous enemies were about to learn exactly what that meant for their continued survival. 2 years after Afghanistan, Sarah Chen no longer officially existed. Her military records had been sealed, her identity scrubbed from databases, and her presence erased from every system that might connect her to the woman who had once been America's most celebrated female Navy SEAL. She was now part of a classified program so secret that most Pentagon officials had never heard of it, a unit known only by its code designation, Ghost Protocol. The program operated from a nondescript office building in Northern Virginia, hidden among dozens of similar structures that housed defense contractors and consulting firms. To the outside world, Global Security Solutions appeared to be just another government services company. In reality, it was the cover for the most elite counterterrorism unit in American intelligence, tasked with operations that were too sensitive for traditional military or CIA involvement. Sarah's handler was a woman she knew only as Director Hayes, no relation to her former training officer, just another carefully constructed identity in a world where real names were dangerous luxuries. Hayes had been running black operations for 20 years, and she understood that the most effective weapons were often the ones that nobody saw coming. "Your next assignment is in Somalia," Hayes explained as she slid a classified folder across the conference table. A humanitarian aid worker named Dr. Rebecca Morrison was kidnapped 3 weeks ago while providing medical care to refugee camps near Mogadishu. The group holding her calls themselves the Sacred Sword of Allah, and they've demanded $10 million for her release. Sarah opened the folder and studied the intelligence brief. Dr. Morrison was a pediatric surgeon from Seattle who had spent the last 5 years providing free medical care in some of the world's most dangerous regions. She was 34 years old, unmarried, and had no family wealth that could pay the ransom demand. "State Department's position?" Sarah asked. "Official policy is no negotiation with terrorists," Hayes replied. "Unofficially, Dr. Morrison is the daughter of Senator Robert Morrison, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. If she dies in captivity, it will be a political disaster that affects everything from foreign aid appropriations to military authorization bills." Sarah nodded, understanding the real parameters of her mission. This wasn't just a rescue operation, it was damage control for a political situation that could reshape American foreign policy if it went wrong. The target was a compound in the Somali countryside, heavily defended and located in territory controlled by various warlords and terrorist groups. Intelligence suggested that Dr. Morrison was being held by a cell of foreign fighters with connections to both Al-Qaeda and local criminal organizations. "Timeline?" Sarah asked. 72 hours, Hayes said. "After that, they've promised to start sending pieces of her back to the American embassy." Sarah studied the satellite images and tactical assessments, memorizing every detail that might affect her approach to the mission. She would be going in alone. Ghost Protocol operations were designed around individual operators who could move through hostile territory without the logistical footprint of larger teams. "Extract options?" "You'll have a support team standing by offshore, but primary extraction is your responsibility. We can provide equipment and intelligence, but once you're on the ground, you're essentially autonomous." That night, Sarah prepared for deployment with the same methodical care she brought to every mission. Her gear was minimal but carefully selected: weapons that were reliable and easy to conceal, communication equipment that would work in the remote Somali terrain, and medical supplies that might be needed for a kidnapping victim who had been held for weeks. But this mission felt different from the counterterrorism operations that had occupied most of her time since Afghanistan. Dr. Morrison wasn't a target to be eliminated or an intelligence asset to be recruited. She was an innocent person whose only crime had been trying to help others, someone who represented the best of what America claimed to stand for in the world. Sarah flew into Djibouti on a commercial flight, carrying papers that identified her as a freelance journalist researching refugee conditions in the Horn of Africa. From there, she made contact with local assets who could provide transportation and intelligence updates about conditions in the target area. The boat ride across the Gulf of Aden was conducted under cover of darkness, with Sarah lying flat in the bottom of a small fishing vessel to avoid detection by patrol boats from various navies operating in the region. When they reached the Somali coast, she waded ashore through surf that was warm despite the late hour, her waterproof gear bag slung across her back. Moving inland through terrain that shifted between rocky desert and scrubland, Sarah made her way toward the compound where Dr. Morrison was being held. She traveled only at night, hiding during daylight hours in carefully selected positions that provided concealment and observation of potential threats. The intelligence briefings had been accurate. The compound was well defended, with sentries posted around the perimeter and heavy weapons positioned to cover the approaches. But Sarah had been trained to operate in exactly these conditions, and she spent 2 days studying the target before making her approach. The kidnappers had made one crucial mistake: they had become comfortable with their security arrangements. After 3 weeks of holding Dr. Morrison without any rescue attempts, they had settled into predictable patterns that created exploitable vulnerabilities in their defenses. Sarah waited until the early hours of morning, when human alertness was naturally at its lowest point, before beginning her infiltration. She moved through the compound's perimeter like a shadow, avoiding the sentries with movements that were both careful and efficient. Finding Dr. Morrison required careful reconnaissance of the buildings within the compound. Sarah used fiber optic cameras to examine rooms through gaps in walls and windows, eventually locating the kidnapped victim in a small concrete structure that had been converted into a makeshift prison. Dr. Morrison was alive but clearly suffering from the effects of prolonged captivity. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and showed signs of physical abuse that made Sarah's jaw clench with controlled anger. But she was conscious and alert, which meant the extraction was feasible. The approach Sarah chose was direct and devastating. Rather than attempting to sneak Dr. Morrison out of the compound, she decided to eliminate the threat permanently. These weren't random criminals who could be discouraged, they were professional terrorists who would simply find other victims if they survived this encounter. Sarah's assault began with the sentries, eliminated silently with techniques that left no trace of struggle or alarm. She moved through the compound systematically, neutralizing threats with a precision that spoke of hundreds of hours of training and operational experience. When she reached the building where Dr. Morrison was held, Sarah found the woman huddled in a corner of her cell, clearly expecting the worst when she heard footsteps approaching her door. "Dr. Morrison," Sarah said quietly as she picked the lock. "I'm here to take you home." The relief in the woman's eyes was immediate and profound. "Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't like it when bad people hurt good people," Sarah replied as she helped Dr. Morrison to her feet. "Can you walk?" Dr. Morrison nodded, though Sarah could see that weeks of captivity had taken a severe toll on her physical condition. She would need medical attention soon, but she was stable enough for extraction. The escape from the compound required different tactics than the infiltration. Sarah had to move quickly while supporting a civilian who was weak from prolonged captivity. She used explosive charges to create diversions that drew the remaining terrorists away from their escape route, then moved with Dr. Morrison toward the extraction point. The fighting that followed was brief but intense. The surviving kidnappers realized what was happening and attempted to prevent their prisoners' escape, but they were dealing with an operator whose skills had been honed through years of the most dangerous missions imaginable. Sarah moved through the firefight with deadly efficiency, her rifle finding targets while she simultaneously protected Dr. Morrison from harm. She used the terrain and darkness to her advantage, striking from unexpected angles and disappearing before return fire could find her position. When the shooting stopped, every member of the terrorist cell was dead, and Sarah was helping Dr. Morrison toward a pre-arranged pickup point where a helicopter would carry them to safety. During the flight to a medical facility in Kenya, Dr. Morrison gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to die in that place." Sarah looked at the woman she had just rescued, someone who had risked her own life to provide medical care to people who had nothing, someone whose only reward had been kidnapping and threatened death. In Dr. Morrison's eyes, she saw a reflection of everything she had sworn to protect when she first put on a military uniform. "That's what we do," Sarah replied simply. "We make sure the good guys get to go home." The mission debrief took place in a secure facility outside Nairobi, with Director Hayes participating via encrypted video link. From an operational standpoint, the rescue had been flawless. Dr. Morrison was safe, the terrorist cell had been eliminated, and there was no evidence that could be traced back to American involvement. But Hayes was more interested in Sarah's psychological state than the tactical success of the operation. "How do you feel about killing 12 people in one night?" Hayes asked during the private portion of the debrief. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "They chose to make money by terrorizing innocent people. They chose to hurt someone whose only crime was trying to help children. I feel fine about stopping them permanently." "No regrets? No second thoughts about the level of force you used?" "My only regret is that it took 3 weeks to find them." Hayes nodded, recognizing the psychological profile that made Sarah such an effective operator. She had evolved beyond the personal vendetta that had originally motivated her military service, developing into something rarer and more valuable, a professional who could apply lethal force without hesitation when protecting innocents, but who would never use those skills for personal gain or satisfaction. "Your next assignment is already being prepared," Hayes said. "There's a human trafficking ring operating between Eastern Europe and Western Africa. They specialize in kidnapping young women from refugee camps and selling them to buyers in the Middle East. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Hayes saw something flicker in her eyes, the cold calculation of someone who was already planning how to dismantle an organization that preyed on the most vulnerable people in the world.
Timeline? 2 weeks for preparation, then deployment. The intelligence package is already being compiled.
As Sarah left the debriefing facility and prepared for her return to the United States, she reflected on how much her understanding of her own purpose had evolved. She was no longer the grief-stricken girl who had joined the military seeking revenge for her brother's death.
She wasn't even the elite operator who had graduated from SEAL training with record-breaking performance scores.
She had become something that the world needed but could never officially acknowledge: a guardian who operated in the spaces between law and justice, someone whose skills existed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. In the shadows of global conflict, Sarah Chen had found her true calling as America's most lethal protector, and the world's predators were beginning to learn that there were consequences for preying on the innocent. The woman who boarded the flight back to Virginia carried no identification that would connect her to her real name or history. She was a ghost in every sense that mattered, someone who existed only to ensure that evil people didn't sleep safely in their beds. And, as the aircraft carried her toward her next mission, Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally understood exactly what she was meant to do with her life. The children's laughter carried across the playground, a sound so pure and innocent that it made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She sat on a bench in Washington, D.C.'s Meridian Hill Park, watching a young mother push her daughter on a swing set while other families enjoyed the perfect spring afternoon.
To anyone observing, Sarah looked like just another professional taking a lunch break from one of the government buildings that dominated this part of the city.
They couldn't see the scars that crisscrossed her body like a roadmap of violence, or the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats that existed nowhere except in her hyper-vigilant mind. They couldn't know that the woman in the conservative business suit had spent the previous month infiltrating a child trafficking network in Thailand, or that her hands had taken 17 lives in the past 6 weeks to rescue victims who would never know her name. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Director Hayes: package delivered successfully.
Client satisfied. New assignment pending.
The package had been 3 American children who had been kidnapped while on vacation with their family in Bangkok. The client was their father, a technology executive whose only connection to national security was his willingness to pay any price to get his children back. But, as Sarah watched the families around her, she felt the weight of everything she had become pressing down on her like a physical burden. 5 years of Ghost Protocol operations had transformed her into the most effective counter-terrorism operative in American intelligence, but they had also stripped away every connection to normal human experience. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed without calculation, or cried for any reason other than tactical necessity. Her apartment in Arlington was sterile and temporary, furnished with items chosen for function rather than comfort. She had no friends outside the intelligence community, no relationships that weren't built on carefully constructed lies, no life beyond the endless cycle of missions that took her to the darkest corners of human cruelty. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Sarah had become extraordinarily good at protecting other people's families while destroying any possibility of having one of her own. Her phone rang, interrupting her surveillance of the playground. Director Hayes' voice was crisp and professional, as always. "We need to meet," Hayes said without preamble. "There's been a development in the Kozlov situation." Viktor Kozlov was a Russian arms dealer who had been on Sarah's target list for 8 months. His organization supplied weapons to terrorist groups and criminal organizations across 3 continents, and intelligence agencies estimated that his activities had resulted in thousands of civilian deaths. But Kozlov was protected by diplomatic immunity and an extensive security network that had made him untouchable through traditional law enforcement methods. Sarah left the park and drove to the safe house in Bethesda where she met regularly with her handler. Hayes was already there, along with a man Sarah didn't recognize, someone whose expensive suit and confident bearing suggested high-level government involvement. "Sarah, meet Assistant Secretary Williams," Hayes said by way of introduction. "He's here to discuss a change in your operational status." Williams studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone who was used to evaluating human assets. "Agent Chen, your service record is remarkable. In 5 years of Ghost Protocol operations, you've completed 37 missions with a 100% success rate. You've rescued 43 hostages, eliminated 68 high-value targets, and disrupted criminal networks worth billions of dollars in illegal revenue." Sarah waited for him to reach his point. She had learned to be suspicious of politicians who led with flattery. The problem, Williams continued, is that your effectiveness has created its own complications. Other agencies are asking questions about how we achieve such consistent results in impossible situations. Foreign intelligence services are starting to develop patterns that point toward a single operator with capabilities that shouldn't exist. You're concerned about exposure, Sarah said. I'm concerned about sustainability, Williams replied. Ghost Protocol was designed to be a temporary solution to specific problems. But, you've become something beyond what the program was intended to create. You're drawing attention that threatens the entire operation. Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious. The recommendation from Langley is that we begin transitioning you toward a more conventional role. Something with official cover, normal oversight, traditional mission parameters. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. You want to put me behind a desk. We want to preserve your value as an asset, Williams said. You could run training programs, develop tactical protocols, consult on operations planning. You'd have official rank again, normal career progression, the opportunity to build a life outside of active operations. For a moment, Sarah imagined what that would look like. Regular hours, predictable schedules, weekends that weren't spent planning infiltrations or recovering from injuries. She could rent an apartment with furniture she actually liked, maybe even adopt a cat. She could take cooking classes, learn to paint, develop hobbies that didn't involve killing people efficiently. The fantasy lasted exactly 10 seconds before reality reasserted itself. While I'm learning watercolor techniques, Sarah said quietly, who's going to rescue the children being sold in Bangkok? Who's going to stop the arms dealers supplying weapons to terrorist cells? Who's going to make sure that people like Dr. Morrison get to come home alive? Williams and Hayes exchanged a glance that confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the real purpose of this meeting. They weren't offering her a promotion, they were trying to neutralize a weapon that had become too effective for their comfort. There are other operators, Williams said. Other assets who can handle those missions. Name one, Sarah challenged. Show me someone else who can do what I do, and I'll turn in my gear tomorrow. The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah had become something unique in the intelligence community, an operator whose combination of skills, experience, and psychological makeup couldn't be replicated or replaced. Her phone buzzed with an urgent message. Director Hayes checked her own device and frowned. What is it? Williams asked. Kozlov just kidnapped a busload of American tourists outside St. Petersburg, Hayes said, her voice tense. 37 people, including 12 children. He's demanding the release of 6 arms dealers currently held in American prisons, plus $50 million in cryptocurrency. Williams looked stricken. Response options? State Department will negotiate, but Kozlov has a history of killing hostages regardless of whether demands are met. This is about sending a message, not collecting ransom. Sarah stood up, her decision crystallized by the recognition that 37 innocent people were about to die while bureaucrats debated career management strategies. I need a flight to Helsinki, she said to Hayes. And, whatever intelligence we have on Kozlov's current security arrangements. Agent Chen, Williams began, we need to discuss. No, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the cold authority that had intimidated terrorists across 4 continents. You need to decide whether you want those children to come home alive, or whether you want to continue this conversation while they're being tortured in a Russian basement. Hayes was already reaching for her secure phone. I'll arrange transportation. Full operational package will be ready in 2 hours. Williams watched Sarah prepare to leave, recognizing that he was witnessing something beyond his ability to control or contain. What if this mission compromises your cover permanently? What if it exposes the entire program? Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Then, you'll have to find someone else to do the job. But, those hostages are going home, and Viktor Kozlov is going to learn why people like him should be afraid of the dark. The flight to Helsinki gave Sarah time to study the intelligence package on Kozlov's operation. The arms dealer had taken the American tourists during a cultural exchange visit to the Hermitage Museum's satellite location, using a coordinated assault that suggested extensive planning and inside information about their itinerary. Kozlov was holding the hostages at a compound outside the city, protected by former Spetsnaz soldiers and an electronic security system that had been designed by the same engineers who protected Russian government facilities. Rescuing 37 people from that location would require tactics that pushed beyond even Sarah's considerable capabilities. But, as she studied the satellite images and tactical assessments, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with accepting an impossible mission. She had spent 5 years learning to exist in the space between achievable and impossible, finding solutions that existed only for someone with her particular combination of skills and psychological makeup. The compound assault began at 3 in the morning, when human alertness was at its lowest point and electronic surveillance systems were most vulnerable to interference. Sarah infiltrated the perimeter with equipment that allowed her to disrupt communications and security cameras without triggering backup systems. What followed was the most complex operation of her career, a room-by-room progression through a heavily defended facility while simultaneously protecting 37 civilians who were being held in multiple locations. She moved through the compound like a force of nature, eliminating threats with surgical precision while coordinating the hostages' movement toward extraction points. The firefight with Kozlov's security team was brief but devastating. These weren't amateur terrorists or opportunistic criminals, they were professional soldiers who understood close-quarters combat and worked together with military efficiency. But they were dealing with an operator whose skills had been perfected through years of operations that most Special Forces soldiers never survived. Sarah found Kozlov in his command center, attempting to coordinate a response to what he clearly couldn't understand or explain. When he saw her approaching through the smoke and chaos of his collapsing compound, his expression shifted from confusion to terror as he realized exactly what was happening to his organization. "You're her," he whispered in accented English. "The American Ghost. I thought you were a legend." "I'm very real," Sarah replied as she raised her weapon. "And you made a mistake when you decided to hurt innocent people." The arms dealer died knowing that his network would be systematically dismantled in the coming months, his associates eliminated one by someone whose existence they had dismissed as intelligence community mythology. The extraction of 37 hostages from Russian territory required coordination with assets that Sarah had never known existed. Military aircraft appeared from directions that suggested launching points in international waters, while electronic warfare specialists provided cover that prevented Russian authorities from tracking their movement. During the flight back to American territory, Sarah sat among the rescued hostages and watched their reunion with family members who had feared they would never see their loved ones again. Children clung to parents, spouses embraced with desperate gratitude, and elderly tourists wept with relief at their unexpected salvation. One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, approached Sarah during the flight and offered her a small wooden doll that had been her comfort during captivity. "Thank you for saving us," the child said with the serious expression of someone who understood exactly what had almost happened to her. Sarah accepted the gift, feeling something crack inside her chest that had been frozen solid for years. "You're safe now," she replied quietly. "No one will ever hurt you again." When they landed at Andrews Air Force Base, Sarah watched the hostages reunite with families who had gathered to welcome them home. Television cameras recorded tearful embraces and expressions of gratitude that would play on news programs for weeks. But Sarah slipped away from the celebration, disappearing into the crowds of military personnel and government officials who had gathered for the arrival. She was already planning her next mission, already thinking about the other threats that needed to be eliminated before they could hurt innocent people. Director Hayes found her sitting alone in a departure lounge, waiting for a commercial flight that would take her back to the anonymous life she had built around the demands of being America's most lethal protector. "The president wants to meet you," Hayes said as she settled into the seat beside Sarah. "There's talk of a Medal of Honor, public recognition for what you've accomplished." Sarah shook her head. "That's not who I am anymore. I'm most effective when nobody knows I exist." "You could have anything you want," Hayes pressed. "Official status, command positions, a normal life with recognition for your service." Sarah looked at the wooden doll the little girl had given her, thinking about all the children who were still trapped in situations where their only hope was someone willing to operate outside the boundaries of conventional warfare. "What I want is for bad people to be afraid," she said quietly. "I want them to lie awake at night wondering if tonight is when someone like me finds them. I want them to know that there are consequences for hurting innocent people, even if they think they're untouchable." Hayes nodded, understanding finally that Sarah had evolved into something beyond traditional military structure or intelligence hierarchy. She had become a force of nature, someone whose existence served as both shield and sword for people who couldn't protect themselves. As Sarah's flight was announced, she stood to board the aircraft that would carry her toward whatever crisis required her unique skills next. The little girl's doll went into her carry-on bag, a reminder that somewhere in the world, 37 people were sleeping safely in their own beds because someone had been willing to become the nightmare that hunted their nightmares. The woman who walked onto that plane no longer resembled the farm girl who had left Nebraska seeking revenge for her brother's death. Sarah Chen had become something unprecedented in military history, a guardian whose methods made her both savior and destroyer, someone whose very existence changed the calculus of evil in the world. In the shadows of global conflict, she had found her purpose as the protector nobody could see coming, and the world was safer because of monsters who now knew they were being hunted by something more dangerous than themselves.